A bitter brew, and one final sip too many. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I'm your host Harrington. Drop a comment below and share where you're listening from. I love hearing it. This community makes each story richer. Now, let's get into it. I don't usually complain about the smell of good espresso drifting through Wolfe's sacred halls. If anything, it's one of the few aromas that can sneak past his olfactory firewall without triggering a complaint. But this particular cup came with a side order of tension, and that's a blend neither of us like. It was a Tuesday. Not that it matters to you, but for Wolfe, it was Orchid Day, which means don't talk, don't breathe, and certainly don't bring visitors. Fritz had just brought down a demi-tasse for the boss, Guatemalan beans dark roasted, the way Wolfe tolerates the world. I was at my desk in the office, cataloguing receipts from a recent job that paid just enough to keep the beer cold, and the orchids warm. That's when the doorbell rang. Now normally I'd do what I usually do in these situations, ignore it and let them wonder if we were home. But something about the ring was persistent, like whoever was out there had nowhere else to be. Or maybe they knew Wolfe's rule about never answering his own door and figured the assistant was fair game. I swung the door open, prepared to say something charming and dismissive, but stopped short. Standing there was a woman, mid-30s. Sharp jawline, sharper eyes, and a coat that cost more than my last case brought in. She held a small box in both hands. Black lacquered wood, no markings, no ribbon. "Mr. Goodwin?" she asked. Her voice had the calm of a chess player about. "To sacrifice a queen, you've got me," I said. "And you are." "Celeste Moretti, I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe." I started to explain the unlikelihood of that happening on an Orchid Day, but she interrupted by holding up the box like it was a diplomatic pouch. "It's about my uncle. He's dead, and I think someone used his espresso habit to kill him." Now, you'd think that might be enough to get a rise out of me. I've heard my share of dramatic entrances, and this one was smooth but not dramatic. It was clinical. I stepped aside and let her in, not because I thought Wolfe would care, but because I did. When someone mentions murder by espresso and hands you a box, you don't send them packing. Not in my line of work. She walked with a confidence I usually associate with prosecutors and head surgeons. In the office, she didn't sit until I pointed at the red chair. "What's in the box?" I asked. "The beans he used the morning he died. He brewed a pot, drank a cup, and collapsed 20 minutes later. The coroner ruled it a heart attack." "I think it was something else." I raised an eyebrow. "You bring the beans to the police?" "No. I brought them to the one man in New York who cares more about beans than cops do about bullets." At that moment, the door behind me creaked open. Wolfe stood there, paunch forward, face a scowl carved in stone. He said nothing, just scanned the room like a man inspecting a shipment he hadn't ordered. I turned. "Mr. Wolfe, this is Celeste Moretti. She believes her uncle may have been murdered by a cup of espresso." He blinked once, turned to me and grunted. "I am on no account to be disturbed today, Archie. Orchid matters cannot wait. Human ones generally can." Celeste stood. She held out the box. "My uncle was Giancarlo Moretti. He imported coffee for half the city's restaurants. If someone used one of his own beans to kill him, that's not just irony. It's a message. And I need the message read." Wolfe's eyes narrowed, and he reached out, not for her hand, but for the box. He took it, turned it once in his palm, and nodded to himself. Then he spoke. Not to her, but to me. "Archie, schedule an interview. 11 tomorrow, and contact Theodore. I want a clean bench in the plant room by nightfall." He turned and disappeared behind the door, the box still in his hand. Celeste blinked. I let out a low whistle. "Well?" I said. "That's the Wolfe. Her version of welcome aboard." She exhaled for the first time since walking in. "Is he always like that?" "No," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Sometimes he's downright unfriendly." By the time Celeste Moretti left the brownstone, the orchids had lost their grip on Wolfe's interest for the day. That meant two things. First, I was going. to be rescheduling some delicate horticultural commitments with Theodore, and second, something in that little lacquered box had rattled the big man's routine. That didn't happen often, and when it did, you knew there was more to the matter than the average tiff over estate money or a straying spouse. Wolfe called me in precisely 6 minutes after she left, by which time he'd already run a preliminary sniff and grumble test over the beans. He was seated as ever behind his desk, the box opened before him, a clean silver teaspoon laid beside it like an autopsy instrument. "Lock the door," he said without looking up. "Sit." I obeyed, clicking the bolt on the office door and dropping into my chair. "She's not lying," Wolfe said. "These beans have been altered. The surface gloss is wrong, too matte. They've been dusted with something, likely fine enough not to be noticed by the tongue once brewed, but enough to coat the inner oils. So, poison? I won't speculate, but it is not merely coffee, and Giancarlo Moretti was not merely a man who liked a morning shot of espresso." I raised an eyebrow. "You knew him?" "Acquainted, briefly. His imports were occasionally of interest to Fritz. He operated a warehouse on 30th and Lexington, a cooperative affair. Imported beans for high-end clientele, many of whom would not want their sourcing practices made public. You're saying he had secrets. I'm saying he had discretion, and discretion, Archie, is currency." I nodded slowly. "And his niece?" "Unsentimental, controlled. A woman used to navigating institutions, possibly law, possibly finance. She said nothing about her job. She said plenty by omission. Her coat was cashmere, hand-tailored, and not off the rack. Her accent is Northwestern but polished, Seattle or Portland. She didn't come here straight from grief. She came from calculation. That is not a criticism." I didn't argue. Wolfe can read a wardrobe like I read a suspect's alibi, down to the seams and thread count. And if he said there was more to Miss Moretti's story than she let on, I believed him. "Find out who benefits," Wolfe continued. "Start with the estate. Then find out who doesn't benefit but believes they should have. I want names, associations, former business partners, and anyone who was in his kitchen the morning he died. If poison was delivered via his espresso, then the killer either knew his habits or controlled his supplies." "And the coroner's report?" I asked. "Get it. Wouldn't be faster to hire Saul?" He frowned. "Saul will be engaged." "Not yet. First, the ground must be softened." I stood. "Soften away, sir. I'll go knock on some roasted doors." It didn't take long to find the basics. Giancarlo Moretti had been 62 when he keeled over in his kitchen. He lived alone in a brownstone of his own, one of those high-end ivy-choked relics in Carroll Gardens, close enough to the waterfront to enjoy ambience, but far enough not to smell it. Neighbors described him as genial, private, and generous. With his espresso machine, the man had installed a $15,000 dual-boiler rig that could steam milk into silk and pull a ristretto with the grace of a ballerina. Not exactly the kind of guy who downs instant and dies slumped over a diner counter. The official story was simple. Cardiac arrest, nothing suspicious, no struggle, no missing items. The house was locked from the inside, and the only visitor that morning was his cleaner, who found him collapsed beside a still-steaming cup. I decided to pay the cleaner a visit. Her name was Dina Costa, and she worked through a private service in Brooklyn. I caught her between jobs, heading into a brownstone in Park Slope with a bucket in one hand and a Bluetooth earpiece in the other. I introduced myself and flashed credentials. Not official, but they looked that way if you moved them fast enough. She gave me a long once-over, then sighed. "You with the insurance?" "Private investigation. Trying to confirm a few details for the family." "Family didn't talk to me," she said. "Didn't want details." "Well, I do," I said. "Let's start with the espresso." Her eyes narrowed. "He made it fresh every time. Beans ground right before brewing. He never let me touch the machine, said even professional baristas had to earn his trust." Was anyone else in the house the morning he died? No. I got there just after 9. He was supposed to be in the garden. That was our schedule. I found him in the kitchen. He'd already poured the espresso. Was the cup empty? Half. It was still warm. I nodded. Anything odd in the kitchen? No, nothing out of place, but the smell, it was wrong. I remember that. Usually the kitchen smelled rich, nutty, roasted. That morning, it was bitter, almost metallic. That caught my attention. You tell the police? I did. They said it was grief. I left her my number and told her not to clean any more crime scenes without calling me first. Then I headed to the warehouse. Wolfe had mentioned Moretti Imports. It was a 2-story industrial block with smoked glass and steel signage, a little too sleek for a bean depot. The office manager was a man named Lorenzo Dell, thin and too friendly, the type who offers you a cappuccino before you've asked your first question. I declined. I'm sorry for your loss, I said. We're helping the family tie up loose ends. I understand Mr. Moretti ran a tight ship. He was the ship, Lorenzo said. He knew the taste profile of every bean we handled. Wouldn't let a shipment go out unless he'd brewed it himself. Did he have enemies? None that I knew, but he had competitors. People don't like losing restaurant contracts to someone with cleaner beans and better deals. Who inherits the business? Lorenzo paused. It's complicated. Celeste is the closest blood relative, but the company isn't a sole proprietorship. There's a board, investors. Giancarlo was the face, but there's infrastructure. That takes time to untangle. I nodded. And his death doesn't affect operations? It does. But not how you think. There's already pressure. Clients asking if we'll keep the same standards. Rumors Giancarlo was about to go exclusive with a distributor. That deal's up in the air now. Do you know who roasted his personal beans? Lorenzo hesitated. He used a private roaster. Small batch outfit called 11 Fires, boutique stuff. He'd pick up orders himself. Did he get a delivery before he died? Yeah. 2 days prior. I thanked him and got out of there. Too much polish, not enough transparency. Lorenzo. Dell had that smooth operator vibe. Overconfident with strangers, underprepared for questions. I called Wolfe from the sidewalk. He had a private supplier. 11 Fires, that's our next stop. Also, the cleaner smelled something odd in the coffee, metallic, bitter. I'd bet your spoon was picking up the same note. I expected as much, Wolfe said. Return at once. We must plan. Bring no guests. I knew that tone. Wolfe was shifting gears. Something in this case was beginning to irritate him. Maybe it was the quality of the subterfuge. Maybe it was the insult to a cup of espresso. Either way, Wolfe was now officially engaged. And if someone had tried to bury a murder in a morning ritual, they were about to find out what real bitterness tasted like. Back at the brownstone, the atmosphere had shifted. Fritz was unusually quiet, which meant he'd picked up on Wolfe's mood. Something in that blend of arrogance and stillness that let you know the mental gears were spinning faster than usual behind the facade of immobility. Wolfe hadn't moved from his chair when I returned, but the lacquered box of beans was gone from the desk, replaced by a stack of monographs on toxicology, plant alkaloids, and, I kid you not, coffee bean chemistry. He didn't look up when I entered, but I knew better than to wait for an invitation. The cleaner confirms the coffee was brewed fresh, I said. Half a cup drunk. She noticed an off smell, bitter, metallic. Nothing else out of place. Wolfe grunted. Good. The metallic note may indicate strychnine, though that would have been noticed by the coroner. We must not assume idiocy unless we are forced to. She says the police dismissed it as grief. Idiocy forced, then. He finally looked at me. The roaster? A place called 11 Fires, boutique operation, strictly wholesale. Moretti picked up the beans himself 2 days before he died. Address? Lower East Side. I was heading there next. Wolfe frowned. Take Saul, I want discretion and a second set of eyes. I didn't argue. When Wolfe deploys Saul Panzer, he's not hedging bets, he's laying groundwork. If something was wrong at 11 Fires, Saul would see it before the rest of us even knew to look. We met just after 3 on Delancey, the storefront wedged between a vegan pet food co-op and a tattoo parlor that specialized in hand-poked symbolism. The roasting facility had glass walls, brushed metal counters, and a barista who looked like he moonlighted as a sculptor. Behind him, through the interior window, a roasting drum spun slowly like a meditation wheel. Saul was already inside, leaning on the bar and sipping something that might have been coffee or molten lava. The owner, it turned out, was a woman named Tasha Shu, mid-40s, compact, sharp-witted. She wore a leather apron and had forearms that suggested she could haul a sack of green beans up a ladder without breaking stride. "We don't do retail," she said, "but I can make you an espresso." "Double?" "Single," I said. "I'm already vibrating from the day." She nodded and moved with efficient grace. While the machine hissed and steamed, Saul stepped beside me and spoke low. "She's alert, watching you more than me. Probably clocked the shoes." "I shine better," I murmured. She returned with a demi-tasse that smelled like thunder. "So, who's dead?" she asked. I blinked. "Excuse me?" "You've got a cop posture but no badge, and he's got private investigator eyes. You're not here for beans." "Giancarlo Moretti," I said, watching her face. A flicker of recognition. Not surprise, confirmation. "He was a client," she said. "Came every 3rd Thursday, picked up in person. Always the same blend. Sumatran base, Ethiopian floral, light roast. Custom recipe. I called it the Capo's Kiss." "Any chance?" "That last bag he picked up was tampered with," she snorted. "Not on my side. We roast same-day bag seal. I double-check his orders myself. He was picky. Insulted my crema once, said it reminded him of bad custard, and if someone else got access to the beans, then they'd have to break my seal. You do that, you don't get aroma bloom. When you grind, he'd have noticed. That's the thing about purists. You can't slip anything past them. You want to poison a guy like Moretti through his espresso. You better have a chemistry degree and a good palate." "Do you?" She met my eyes squarely. "Yes." I let that sit for a moment. "Did he say anything odd last time he was in?" She hesitated. "Yeah. He asked if I'd ever heard of a bean called Tenebra. Black as ink. No label, no origin. Said someone sent him a sample anonymously. Claimed it was a legacy roast. Sounded like nonsense. Did he show it to you?" "No." Said he hadn't opened it yet. Said it gave him a weird feeling. I told him to toss it. Saul leaned forward. "Did he?" She shrugged. "I don't know. But Giancarlo didn't toss anything without tasting it first. That gave me a chill. I thanked her and stepped outside with Saul. We moved to a quiet corner. "What do you think?" I asked. "She's telling the truth," he said. "But someone. Use the boutique supply as cover. That anonymous sample, Tenebra, that's your delivery method. The real question is, who knew enough about his habits to know he'd brew it alone in his kitchen and not tell anyone?" We split up. Saul said he'd circle back on Tasha's suppliers and see if anyone else in the industry had heard of Tenebra. I called Wolfe from a payphone because I didn't want his landline glared at by the FCC if the story got out early. "Tenebra," I said. "That's our ghost roast. Someone mailed it to him anonymously. No origin. He kept it, possibly brewed. It possibly died from it." Wolfe didn't speak for a moment, then, "Return now." Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was rereading an article in Scientific Monthly about cyanogenic glycosides. He looked up and, for the first time that day, showed something approaching interest. "You said the name was Tenebra?" he asked. "Yeah. Ring a bell?" He nodded slowly. "There was a rumored varietal decades ago illegal to import, grown in volcanic soil in a disputed region between Colombia and Ecuador. The story went that the bean contained trace amounts of alkaloids that weren't destroyed by roasting. The effect wasn't immediate. It mimicked stress-related heart failure, difficult to trace. And illegal, extinct, supposedly. The plant was eradicated, but stories survive. Someone could create a facsimile, maybe even cultivate a rogue strain. So someone sends Giancarlo this ghost bean, waits for him to brew it, yes, and leaves no obvious mark. He turned toward me fully now. Archie, we're dealing with a crime concealed not through cleverness but through plausibility. Heart failure in a man of his age. No immediate financial gain. No struggle. It was intended to be natural, unexamined. That is not opportunistic murder. It is strategic elimination. Who benefits from the elimination? Perhaps no one, Wolfe said, but someone certainly fears exposure. Moretti was receiving offers, likely declining them. That blend, Tenebra, was a signature, a warning or a silencing. He reached for the phone. Fritz, dinner in the conservatory. I wish to smell orchids while I think. I stood, waiting for the order. Wolfe didn't disappoint. Find out who wanted to buy Moretti's business, who needed him out of the way quietly, permanently. And if it's someone who doesn't drink coffee, Wolfe gave a thin smile. Then it is someone who prefers tea, and we must beware of those, Archie. They steep longer. I started with the angle Wolfe had pointed me toward, who wanted to buy Moretti's business. It made sense. You don't poison a man with ghost beans, unless removing him is more profitable than negotiating with him. And in a niche market like specialty coffee, Moretti wasn't just a supplier. He was a tastemaker. If he liked your roast, you sold. To half of Manhattan. If he didn't, you went back to pushing beans in Brooklyn bodegas and pretending to appreciate earthy notes. The easiest way to find out who'd been courting Moretti was to ask the people who had something to gain from his absence. So I started where business got done. His lawyer. Enter one Benjamin Klasky, a pinched, hawk-faced estate attorney with offices on Madison and 42nd. His receptionist looked at me like I was there to repo the furniture, but she softened when I dropped the phrase ongoing inquiry related to the passing of Mr. Giancarlo Moretti, and flashed one of my best non-smiling smiles. Klasky's office smelled like carpet glue and guarded optimism. He wore a suit with a sheen and glasses that magnified his pupils to saucers. His handshake was dry and brief. If this is about the will, I'm bound by confidentiality, he said, before I even sat down. Good. I'm not interested in the will. I folded into the chair across from his desk. I'm interested in people who wanted to buy Moretti's company before he died. That made him blink. Why? Because I don't believe he died of natural causes. And if someone's pockets got deeper after he stopped breathing, that's a lead. He leaned back. There were inquiries, one serious. Name? Luciano Della Vecchia. Operates out of Florence. European distributor looking to establish an East Coast presence. Old-school money. Flashy branding. He approached Giancarlo 3 times last year. And? Giancarlo declined each time. Flat refusals. Said he'd rather let the company dissolve than sell to someone who viewed coffee as a brand experience. I jotted that down. Anyone else? There was domestic interest. Smaller players. Boutique roasters. Local chains. One in particular, Café Vesuvio, was persistent. I looked up. The chain with the volcano logo. That's the one. Their director of acquisitions is a woman named Minna Rourke. She contacted Giancarlo 4 times over 6 months. Last call was 2 weeks before his death. Now that was a breadcrumb Wolfe would chew on. I thanked Klasky, slipped him my card, and headed for Café Vesuvio's downtown office. If Rourke had pushed too hard or gotten too desperate, I wanted to see it in her face before she had time to rehearse. Vesuvio's headquarters were all glass walls and espresso stations. The kind of place where meetings happened over reclaimed wood tables, and every desk had a plant and a laptop with motivational stickers. Minna Rourke greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was lean, mid-40s, dressed in espresso. Tones with blood-red lipstick that said she'd never been told no twice. Her handshake was warmer than Klasky's, but her grip was firmer. "I assume this is about Giancarlo Moretti," she said, leading me into a soundproof meeting pod shaped like a lozenge. "You assume right. I understand you tried to buy his company. We tried to acquire it, yes," he declined repeatedly. "What was your pitch?" "Synergy, visibility, growth." She rolled the words out like gumdrops. He wasn't interested in scaling. He thought it would compromise his reputation. And what did you think? She gave a thin smile. I thought he was wrong. Enough to poison him? The smile vanished. "I didn't kill him," she said flatly. "That's a ridiculous question." "Then you won't mind if I ask where you were the day he died?" "On a plane. To Denver. Red-eye the night before." "I can provide the itinerary." I made a mental note to follow up, but something told me she wasn't lying. People who poison by nuance usually don't wear their ambition like a billboard. "Did you ever hear of a blend called Tenebra?" That shook her. Not much, but enough. "To catch?" "Yes, I've heard the story." "From where?" "Trade gossip. Old roaster myths. I thought it was just a romantic name people gave mystery blends at competitions. What if it wasn't a myth?" She crossed her legs, her posture shifting. Less PR, more predator. Then someone went to a lot of trouble to make a point. What kind of point? That Giancarlo wasn't untouchable. That stuck with me on the cab ride back. Wolfe was in his chair when I returned, fingers steepled, eyes closed. He didn't open them when I began the report. Klasky confirmed 2 potential buyers, 1 foreign, Della Vecchia, from Florence. 1 domestic, Minna Rourke at Café Vesuvio. Both refused. Rourke was on a plane the day he died. Her alibi checks, but she knew the name Tenebra, claimed it was industry myth. Wolfe opened his eyes. An alibi does not preclude complicity. She may have provided incentive or suggestion to someone else, like a middleman or a zealot. The problem with idealists, Archie, is they make excellent killers. I leaned on the desk. You think this wasn't just business? Business, if executed improperly, becomes personal. And revenge, when seasoned with ideology, tends to be slow-brewed. He tapped a folder on the desk. I received the coroner's report. The pathologist noted minor discoloration of the tongue, not enough to warrant toxicology. I've requested the body be exhumed. I whistled low. You think we'll find trace compounds? If Tenebra is what we suspect, yes. An alkaloid, perhaps slow-acting or metabolically elusive. But if I am correct, the presence will be in the tissue, not the bloodstream. Any thoughts on this Della Vecchia guy? Too far. Too risky. He would have sent someone. Track his known associates in the States. And call Saul. I want surveillance. On Café Vesuvio. If they're involved, they'll act soon, perhaps to cover tracks or secure a new target. I stood to leave, but Wolfe held up a finger. One more thing, Archie. Sir. Miss Moretti, has she been in contact? No. Find? Clout, why? If she is as composed as she seems, she's either used to loss or she's used to secrets. That was Wolfe all over. Just when you thought you'd covered every angle, he was already looking at the corners. And if Miss Moretti had been playing it cool from the beginning, maybe it was time someone saw what her heat looked like. The next morning started with a silence that meant Wolfe was thinking, not sulking, an important distinction in a household where mood dictated motion. Fritz brought the breakfast trays up without incident, and I knew better than to pester the boss while he was buttering his cornbread and stewing over rare alkaloids. I spent that time making calls. First to the airport to confirm Minna Rourke's flight, Delta Red-Eye JFK to Denver. Landed at 7:12 a.m. the morning Giancarlo Moretti died, checked out. Her alibi, while inconveniently solid, didn't rule her out as the brains behind a broader operation. Next was Saul. He'd been parked across the street from Café Vesuvio's midtown storefront since dawn, nursing a stale scone and a thermos of bad coffee that he refused to blame me for. "Rourke hasn't shown," he said, "but one of her junior managers just met with someone from a freight company. Quiet conversation, 15 minutes, no paperwork, suspicious only if you're looking for it." I thanked him and told him to stay put, then dialed the number Celeste Moretti had left on her card. It rang 6 times before she picked up. "Goodwin." Her tone was clipped, not surprised, not warm. "I was expecting you yesterday." "I was busy finding out who wanted your uncle out of the way," I said. "We need to talk." "Then, talk. In person." A pause. Then, "My office, noon. Park Avenue. Top floor. Bring whatever assumptions you've made. I'll bring the facts." She hung up without waiting for confirmation. I arrived at her office 15 minutes early and still felt late. The lobby smelled like orchids and ambition. Celeste's receptionist was a lacquered man in a wool suit who ushered me into a glass and steel war room with a view of half the city. Celeste stood at the far end looking out, not turning. "You found something," she said. "Enough to know your uncle didn't die of old age. Enough to know someone sent him a death sentence in a coffee bag. And enough to wonder what you're not telling me." She turned. Calm, composed, but there was heat behind the eyes now. Controlled fire. "You think I'm involved? I think you're smart. And I think you don't look like someone grieving a sudden, tragic loss." She walked to a cabinet and pulled out a file folder. "He wasn't my uncle by blood. He was my mother's first husband. They divorced before I was born. I took her name. Giancarlo remarried, twice, no children either time. But he never stopped being a part of my life." She slid the folder across the table. "Here's what I didn't say. I worked for him. Quietly. Financial modeling, logistics, expansion options. He didn't trust many people. He trusted me." I opened the folder. Graphs, export licenses, notes on a new distribution model targeting eco-conscious buyers. "He was planning to expand?" I asked, cautiously. But he was also scared. 3 weeks before he died, someone sent him an envelope. No return address. Inside, a photo of our roaster in Brooklyn. Slashed tires. Spray paint on the wall. "Keep out." That's when he told me he'd received samples of a mystery roast. Said it came in a box with no stamp, just the word Tenebra embossed inside the lid. Did he try it? He said he hadn't. But Giancarlo was a creature of temptation. If someone dared him not to drink it, he would. That tracked. I closed the folder. "Why not tell us this the first day?" "Because I needed to see if you were smart enough to find it yourself," I smiled. "You sound like Wolfe." "No," she said. "Wolfe sounds like someone who's always been obeyed. I'm someone who's always been ignored." She sat down now, the fire cooling into intent. Minna Rourke visited the warehouse once. Unannounced, smiled, looked around, said she admired Giancarlo's old-world integrity. The next day, one of our delivery trucks was rear-ended and totaled. Driver unharmed, beans destroyed. "You think she's behind this?" "I think she wanted the business. I think she wanted it cheap. Wolfe thinks someone feared Giancarlo would expose something, that he knew more than just how to brew." She hesitated. "There's one more name. He mentioned it the night before he died. He said, 'I didn't think he'd still be in the game.'" "Who?" "Luca Della Vecchia, the Italian distributor." I leaned back. How'd they know each other? Years ago, before Giancarlo came to New York, he tried to run a farm in Colombia, got chased out by narcos. He wouldn't talk about it. But Luca, he didn't get chased. He stayed, and he got rich. I stood. That's motive. She didn't respond. Just nodded once. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting with a pot of jasmine tea. his signal that we were in the deeper waters now. He listened while I laid it all out. Celeste's partial confession, the photo, the file, the boamb, mention of Luca. Della Vecchia has motive and reach, I concluded, and he has history, Wolfe grunted. That explains much, including the restraint. Restraint? He didn't want it to look like murder. He wanted it to look like justice, personal, precise. And he used the one thing Giancarlo would never suspect, his palate. Still think we'll find the poison in the body? Wolfe closed his eyes. We may not need to. If Luca is indeed behind this, he will not tolerate loose ends. He may try to secure Vesuvio, or silence Celeste. That made me pause. Do you think she's in danger? I think anyone who can speak Giancarlo's truth is in danger, including you. I gave a dry chuckle. Flattering? Wolfe opened his eyes. Don't be flattered. Be ready. We are entering the stage where people stop pretending. That night we set Fritz to making a Tuscan dinner. Wolfe's request: veal with sage, pine nuts, and a dark roasted espresso reduction. A message, I suspected, not just to the killer, to himself, because Nero Wolfe doesn't eat the battlefield, he dines on it. The next morning brought fog inside and out. The city was a grey blur through the office windows, and inside the brownstone Wolfe was wrapped in one of his heavier robes, his expression suggesting he'd been thinking deeply and enjoying none of it. Breakfast was quiet. Fritz served soft-boiled eggs with sea salt and brioche. Wolfe consumed both with mechanical efficiency, while I worked through 2 cups of coffee that had nothing to do with pleasure and everything to do with readiness. At 10:22 a.m., Saul called. She moved. He said, "Rourke." "Yeah, left the Midtown office. Took a black sedan downtown, not a Vesuvio car, no plate scan. She met a man in a suit at the Fulton Market entrance. European cut, expensive. Tall, late 50s, didn't smile. They entered the parking garage. Anne disappeared for 20 minutes. You get a look at the guy? Got a photo, sending it now. 30 seconds later my phone pinged. I opened the image and whistled low. "Saul," I said, "if I could afford to pay you what you're worth, I'd be broke in a week." "That's fair." I ended the call and brought the phone over to Wolfe, who was already setting aside the morning's correspondence. I handed it to him, and he examined the photo. Saul had snapped it through a reflection in a bakery window. It was grainy, but you could make out Rourke's jawline, tense as a spring, and the man beside her. Wolfe grunted. "Luca Della Vecchia." Confirmed. "I'd bet Fritz's celeriac puree on it. A grave statement in our household." Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled. "She flew in Della Vecchia, which means either they're celebrating or panicking." "Indeed. And if they're panicking, they're dangerous. Think they'll try to clean house?" That was Wolfe all over. Just when you thought you'd covered every angle, he was already looking at the corners. And if Miss Moretti had been playing it cool from the beginning, maybe it was time someone saw what her heat looked like. The next morning started with a silence that meant Wolfe was thinking, not sulking, an important distinction in a household where mood dictated motion. Fritz brought the breakfast trays up without incident, and I knew better than to pester the boss while he was buttering his cornbread and stewing over rare alkaloids. I spent that time making calls. First to the airport to confirm Minna Rourke's flight, Delta Red-Eye JFK to Denver, landed at 7:12 a.m. the morning Giancarlo Moretti died, checked out. Her alibi, while inconveniently solid, didn't rule her out as the brains behind a broader operation. Next was Saul. He'd been parked across the street from Café Vesuvio's Midtown storefront since dawn, nursing a stale scone and a thermos of bad coffee that he refused to blame me for. "Rourke hasn't shown," he said, "but one of her junior managers just met with someone from a freight company. Quiet conversation, 15 minutes, no paperwork, suspicious only if you're looking for it." I thanked him and told him to stay put, then dialed the number Celeste Moretti had left on her card. It rang 6 times before she picked up. Goodwin. Her tone was clipped, not surprised, not warm. I was expecting you yesterday. I was busy finding out who wanted your uncle out of the way, I said. We need to talk. Then, talk. In person. A pause. Then, my office, noon. Park Avenue. Top floor. Bring whatever assumptions you've made. I'll bring the facts. She hung up without waiting for confirmation. I arrived at her office 15 minutes early and still felt late. The lobby smelled like orchids and ambition. Celeste's receptionist was a lacquered man in a wool suit who ushered me into a glass and steel war room with a view of half the city. Celeste stood at the far end looking out, not turning. You found something, she said. Enough to know your uncle didn't die of old age. Enough to know someone sent him a death sentence in a coffee bag. And enough to wonder what you're not telling me. She turned. Calm, composed, but there was heat behind the eyes now. Controlled fire. You think I'm involved? I think you're smart. And I think you don't look like someone grieving a sudden, tragic loss. She walked to a cabinet and pulled out a file folder. He wasn't my uncle by blood. He was my mother's first husband. They divorced before I was born. I took her name. Giancarlo remarried, twice, no children either time. But he never stopped being a part of my life. She slid the folder across the table. Here's what I didn't say. I worked for him. Quietly. Financial modeling, logistics, expansion options. He didn't trust many people. He trusted me. I opened the folder. Graphs, export licenses, notes on a new distribution model targeting eco-conscious buyers. He was planning to expand, I asked, cautiously. But he was also scared. 3 weeks before he died, someone sent him an envelope. No return address. Inside, a photo of our roaster in Brooklyn. Slashed tires. Spray paint on the wall. Keep out. That's when he told me he'd received samples of a mystery roast. Said it came in a box with no stamp, just the word Tenebra embossed inside the lid. Did he try it? He said he hadn't. But Giancarlo was a creature of temptation. If someone dared him not to drink it, he would. That tracked. I closed the folder. Why not tell us this the first day? Because I needed to see if you were smart enough to find it yourself, I smiled. You sound like Wolfe. No, she said. Wolfe sounds like someone who's always been obeyed. I'm someone who's always been ignored. She sat down now, the fire cooling into intent. Minna Rourke visited the warehouse once. Unannounced, smiled, looked around, said she admired Giancarlo's old-world integrity. The next day, one of our delivery trucks was rear-ended and totaled. Driver unharmed, beans destroyed. You think she's behind this? I think she wanted the business. I think she wanted it cheap. Wolfe thinks someone feared Giancarlo would expose something, that he knew more than just how to brew. She hesitated. There's one more name. He mentioned it the night before he died. He said, I didn't think he'd still be in the game. Who? Luca Della Vecchia, the Italian distributor. I leaned back. How'd they know each other? Years ago, before Giancarlo came to New York, he tried to run a farm in Colombia, got chased out by narcos. He wouldn't talk about it. But Luca, he didn't get chased. He stayed and he got rich. I stood. That's motive. She didn't respond. Just nodded once. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting with a pot of jasmine tea, his signal that we were in the deeper waters now. He listened while I laid it all out. Celeste's partial confession, the photo, the file, the boam, mention of Luca. Della Vecchia has motive and reach, I concluded, and he has history. Wolfe grunted. That explains much, including the restraint. Restraint? He didn't want it to look like murder. He wanted it to look like justice, personal, precise. And he used the one thing Giancarlo would never suspect, his palate. Still think we'll find the poison in the body? Wolfe closed his eyes. We may not need to. If Luca is indeed... Behind this, he will not tolerate loose ends. He may try to secure Vesuvio, or silence Celeste. That made me pause. Do you think she's in danger? I think anyone who can speak Giancarlo's truth is in danger, including you. I gave a dry chuckle. Flattering? Wolfe opened his eyes. Don't be flattered. Be ready. We are entering the stage where people stop pretending. That night we set Fritz to making a Tuscan dinner. Wolfe's request: veal with sage, pine nuts, and a dark roasted espresso reduction. A message, I suspected, not just to the killer, to himself, because Nero Wolfe doesn't eat the battlefield, he dines on it. The next morning brought fog inside and out. The city was a grey blur through the office windows, and inside the brownstone Wolfe was wrapped in one of his heavier robes, his expression suggesting he'd been thinking deeply and enjoying none of it. Breakfast was quiet. Fritz served soft-boiled eggs with sea salt and brioche. Wolfe consumed both with mechanical efficiency, while I worked through 2 cups of coffee that had nothing to do with pleasure and everything to do with readiness. At 10:22 a.m., Saul called. She moved. He said, "Rourke." "Yeah, left the Midtown office. Took a black sedan downtown, not a Vesuvio car, no plate scan. She met a man in a suit at the Fulton Market entrance. European cut, expensive. Tall, late 50s, didn't smile. They entered the parking garage. Anne disappeared for 20 minutes. You get a look at the guy? Got a photo, sending it now. 30 seconds later my phone pinged. I opened the image and whistled low. "Saul," I said, "if I could afford to pay you what you're worth, I'd be broke in a week." "That's fair." I ended the call and brought the phone over to Wolfe, who was already setting aside the morning's correspondence. I handed it to him, and he examined the photo. Saul had snapped it through a reflection in a bakery window. It was grainy, but you could make out Rourke's jawline, tense as a spring, and the man beside her. Wolfe grunted. "Luca della Vecchia." Confirmed. I'd bet Fritz's celeriac puree on it. A grave statement in our household. Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled. "She flew in Della Vecchia," which means either they're celebrating or panicking. Indeed. And if they're panicking, they're dangerous. Think they'll try to clean house? They may already be trying. We must make their position untenable. Expose the link? Not yet. That requires pressure. One more squeeze. You will return to Miss Moretti, inform her of Della Vecchia's arrival, gauge her reaction. She may be our lever. I headed back to her office, now familiar enough with the building's flow to skip the receptionist and go straight to the source. She looked up from a series of ledgers as I walked in, raising one eyebrow. "Did something break?" "Something landed," I said, dropping into the seat across from her. "Your uncle's old acquaintance just arrived in New York. He met with Minna Rourke this morning. 20 minutes, no smiles." Celeste sat very still. "Luca." "That's right. If there was ever a time to play your cards, it's now." She looked away for a long moment, then stood and walked to the window. "Do you know why Giancarlo left Colombia? I know there were threats. He was laundering for the wrong people. Coffee was just the cover. Exported beans, imported favors. When he tried to stop, things got ugly. He barely escaped with his life. And Luca didn't stop. He expanded, formalized. Giancarlo once told me Luca was the kind of man who poisons rivers to build dams." She turned back to me. "If he's here, it's not to close a deal, it's to end a trail." "You?" "Maybe. Or someone who could be persuaded to speak. Giancarlo kept notes. A black ledger. If Luca thinks it still exists..." I sat up. "Does it?" She hesitated. "I don't know. He told me about it once. Said if he ever died off schedule, I should look for the book behind the past." Behind. I stopped. Was he into riddles? Only when terrified. That gave me enough to work with. I headed straight to Giancarlo's brownstone. The police had released the premises days ago, and the front door lock still worked with the key Celeste had loaned me. Inside, it smelled faintly of citrus and disuse. I moved through the rooms quickly. Nothing obvious behind paintings or in desk drawers. Then I reached his study. The wall was lined with coffee table books on botany, trade, even poetry, odd but consistent with someone who had tried to flee a past by burying it in pages. I looked for anything that fit the phrase behind the past. It was a photo album that tipped me off. One volume had been moved slightly out of alignment. I pulled it, flipped through. Vacations, old warehouses, Giancarlo in front of a coffee farm. Then I noticed the inside back cover had been repasted. I peeled it gently. Behind the cover was a black notebook, thin, leather-bound. No title. No markings. Inside names, numbers, coded references, payments, dates, acronyms. One name repeated, LD, always adjacent to payments tagged Sombra and Casper. Whatever they meant, they weren't in reference to coffee quality. I left the house by the back door, circled once to make sure I wasn't followed, and headed straight for the brownstone. Wolfe took the ledger with the kind of reverence most people reserve for holy texts. He spent an hour reading. Then, "This is it, Archie. Proof of a trafficking network disguised in bean exports. Old, but not obsolete. This ledger has teeth." "What's the play?" "Call Miss Rourke. Tell her we're in possession of Giancarlo's private journal. Say nothing more, offer no details. Simply inform her we intend to return it to the family formally through legal channels. She'll panic. She'll signal Della Vecchia, and he will act. Dangerous. Indeed. Which is why you will not leave the brownstone for the next 24 hours. That was Wolfe's way of saying someone might try to kill me. We made the call. Rourke was calm, but I heard the tension when I said ledger. Her tone shifted, went cool, clipped. "I see," she said. "Thank you for the courtesy." She hung up. Wolfe smiled. "She'll reach out to him, and he will try to retrieve it. And when he does, we'll have him. But what if he doesn't take the bait? He will. The ledger ties him to 3 decades of financial crime. It names people still in power. He cannot allow it to surface, even for show." Fritz brought in dinner, veal again, this time with black truffle risotto. Wolfe barely tasted it. His eyes were fixed on the phone, waiting for the response that would confirm it all. It came at 9:17 p.m. A courier arrived, no return name. Envelope addressed to Wolfe, handwritten. Inside, a note. "Name your price. This is bigger than one man's." "Reputation." Signed. L.D. Wolfe handed it to me without comment. The game, as they say, was now in check. The next move would determine whether it ended with a signature or an arrest. Wolfe reread the note with a look I've only seen a few times. When someone misquoted Pliny the Elder, when a gourmet magazine praised a supermarket truffle oil, and now, apparently, when Luca Della Vecchia tried to bribe him like a common auctioneer. "Name your price," I said, reading it again myself. "He really doesn't know you." Wolfe grunted. "He doesn't want to. People like Della Vecchia believe principle is a negotiating tactic. They find it inconvenient that some of us treat it as structural." "Then what's our next move? Call the feds?" "No, not yet. Della Vecchia is cautious, but he is here. He's exposed. I want him to attempt the retrieval. I want him cornered by his own audacity." He stood, a rare thing, and began to pace. The last time he'd done that was when a judge's nephew tried to bribe him into suppressing evidence. Wolfe called it digestive locomotion. I called it something was about to happen. "We need to arrange a meeting," he said, "one that forces his hand. He must believe he can regain control. We will offer the ledger, not for sale but for exchange. He will assume duplicity. He must. That's when he will reveal desperation." "You want him scared. I want him clumsy." I spent the next 2 hours calling around. With Saul's help, we arranged a venue, neutral, public, controlled. A private meeting room at a midtown law firm Saul had once worked security for. No windows, one entrance, wired for sound. Wolfe dictated the message. The ledger is not for sale. However, out of professional courtesy, Nero Wolfe is willing to discuss its contents. 1 hour, Thursday 3 p.m., 47th Street and Madison, Suite 9F. It went out via courier. No reply came. Not until Thursday, 2:53 p.m., Della Vecchia arrived in person. He entered the meeting room like he owned it. Italian wool suit, gloves he didn't. Remove, and a cologne that could have doubled as a diplomatic overture. Behind him stood a man we hadn't seen before. Lean, square jaw, broken nose. Professional silence. I watched from a separate surveillance room, eyes on the feed, earpiece, tuned to Wolfe's calm baritone. He was seated at the conference table, arms folded, the black ledger on the table in front of him, like a patient on an operating slab. Della Vecchia didn't sit at first. He walked slowly around the table, hands behind his back. "This," he said with a nod to the ledger, "isn't real." "No?" Wolfe's tone was cool. "Then I assume you have no objection to its return to Miss Moretti." Della Vecchia's eyes narrowed. "She's a child, sentimental, unfit to handle what this contains." "And you are?" Wolfe asked. "I'm someone who understands scale, complexity, legacy." "Ah," Wolfe leaned back. "Yes. You see, I don't. I prefer truth. Often smaller, simpler, and remarkably durable." Della Vecchia laughed, but it was empty. "You think you're holding leverage. You're not. You're holding a story. And stories are only dangerous if people believe them." "Then you should have no fear," Wolfe said. "Unless, of course, the story includes coded accounts, names of trafficked intermediaries, and receipts that link you to shipments you once claimed had been lost at sea." That froze him. Just for a second. But in this game, a second is a scream. "You're not going to publish it," he said. "No." Wolfe's voice was silk over steel. "But I will give it to the authorities, unless you tell me the name of the person who sent Moretti the Tenebra blend." Silence. "Refuse," Wolfe continued, "and I will ensure this ledger reaches federal hands by midnight. You have a preference for discretion, Mr. Della Vecchia, but so do they. Especially when racketeering, tax evasion, and import fraud cross borders." Della Vecchia sat, slowly, gloved hands folded. "She was not supposed to die," he said. "The blend was a warning, a symbol." "Symbolism," Wolfe said, "has a curious tendency to kill people. I sent the beans, but I didn't poison them. You expected him to brew something sent without return address, to consume it without testing? I expected him to remember. Remember what? Colombia. What we survived. What he turned his back on. How you sent poison disguised as nostalgia," Wolfe said. "That is a tactic, not regret." Della Vecchia leaned forward. "I warned him, twice. He ignored me. He was going to expose everything. Burn it all down. For what? Clean legacy? Redemption? I gave him a choice. He made the wrong one." The room was quiet. Wolfe spoke again, low and sharp. "And Rourke?" She handled the logistics, but she didn't know. She thought it was intimidation, not elimination. Della Vecchia rose. "If you turn that ledger over, you won't survive the fire. Neither will she." He left. No handshake, no backward glance. I entered the room a moment later. Wolfe looked up. "You heard. Every word." "Good." Back at the brownstone, Saul was already preparing transcripts. Wolfe called Inspector Kramer, told him to bring someone from Federal Investigations. When Kramer asked why, Wolfe merely said, Because I have a story, one they will believe. By the time the agents arrived, Wolfe was seated, ledger closed, transcript printed. No drama, just order. They listened, they read, they asked questions. Wolfe answered 3. That was enough. Della Vecchia was arrested the next morning at JFK. Rourke turned herself in that afternoon. She hadn't known the full picture, but she'd traced enough shadows to realize she'd been working for something rotten. As for the ledger, it was turned over under seal. Wolfe insisted on a single condition, that Celeste Moretti receive a copy of all pages relevant to her uncle's life and death. That night, after the reporters had gone and Fritz served duck with morel sauce and a neat bitter espresso for dessert, Wolfe raised his demitasse slightly. History, he said, is not composed of heroes and villains, only of people who feared being forgotten. I nodded. And some who poisoned coffee to be remembered. He gave me a look. Archie, really, that's far too poetic. I shrugged, just trying to keep up. The next morning arrived as quiet as a confession. Rain tapped the windows in a lazy rhythm, and the city, muffled in wet wool, moved slower than usual. In the brownstone, though, stillness had a different flavor. It meant something was ending, a case, a danger, a lie. Wolfe didn't speak during breakfast. He worked through a soft-boiled egg, asparagus, and toasted brioche with what passed for a quiet satisfaction in his world. He even nodded once at Fritz's seasoning, which was the culinary equivalent of an ovation. I held off with the questions until the tray was cleared. Then I leaned back, stretched, and said, "So, Della Vecchia's locked up. Rourke's flipping faster than a short-order cook. The ledger's in federal hands, that it." Wolfe didn't look up. "Not quite. Of course not. Nothing's ever quite in Wolfe's world until the moral scales are balanced and the last breadcrumb swept from the floor." He finally turned his gaze toward me. "There is the matter of Miss Moretti." "What about her?" "She has been central to this matter emotionally, strategically, and perhaps more than we understood." I paused. "You think she's hiding something else?" "I think she's owed something more." I tilted my head. "Sympathy from you? That's new," he grimaced. "Not sympathy, clarity. Her name will now be associated with criminal legacy, press scandal, and corporate rebranding, whether she desires it or not. And you're worried?" "No, I'm disgusted." That, I believed. At Wolfe's instruction, I called Celeste. She didn't answer at first. I waited 30 minutes, then tried again. This time she picked up with a voice like ash, burned down but still standing. "Goodwin," she said, "is it done?" "More or less. Luca's in federal hands. Rourke's talking. The ledger's being processed. You're clear." "No." "One's ever clear," she said, "only unread." She agreed to come by. When she arrived, the brownstone seemed to inhale. Even Fritz stepped aside with the kind of respectful silence he reserved for grieving clients. Wolfe received her in the office, his chair turned just slightly toward the window, not a gesture of warmth, but not entirely cold either. Celeste sat with practiced ease. She wore black, not as mourning, but as statement. Her eyes were hollow but alert. "Thank you," she said. "No need," Wolfe replied. "The truth served itself." She looked at him. "No, you served it. I just handed you the box." Wolfe waved a hand. "You gave us something more than that. You gave us direction." There was a long pause. Rain still whispered at the windows. The orchids upstairs were drinking it in. "You know," she said quietly, "Giancarlo hated legacies, thought they were just guilt with better PR. Then he died appropriately," Wolfe said. "He left no legacy, only warnings." Celeste nodded. "What happens now?" "You'll be contacted. Federal investigators will have questions. Your cooperation will be requested." "And the business?" "That depends. There is market value in survival. Moretti imports will weather scandal, especially if someone credible speaks clearly. I'm not a saint. No. But you're the only person in that story who didn't lie to themselves." She exhaled. I could almost hear a weight slide off her shoulders. "Thank you," she said again, this time softer. Wolfe inclined his head. "I dislike murder, but I despise dishonesty. Yours was proportionate." She stood, smiled, just barely, and extended her hand. Wolfe didn't rise, of course, but he reached out briefly and shook it. That was as much closure as you get in this line of work. She left, heels echoing down the hallway, trailing the faintest scent of orange peel and endings. When the door closed, I turned to Wolfe. "Satisfied?" He grunted. I knew the grunt. It meant something like yes for now. The case had been unconventional. No gunshots, no bloody crime scene, just a man undone by his own history, a legacy poisoned not just by beans, but by choices long buried and half denied. Wolfe didn't rise from his chair for hours. He simply sat, staring at the rain, no doubt replaying every word Della Vecchia had said, every nuance of Rourke's confession, every blink Celeste had suppressed. I spent the time organizing files, typing notes, and drafting a summary Wolfe would ignore but insist on having printed. By the time dinner rolled around, rack of lamb with rosemary juice, there was peace in the air. We ate in the dining room. Wolfe was quiet, contemplative. I sipped my wine and waited for his final words on the matter. They always came. They were always worth hearing. After dessert, apple tart with bourbon cream, he sat back and folded his napkin precisely. "Archie," he said, "coffee is a ritual, is a preparation, a habit of intimacy with oneself. That is why this case was offensive." I nodded. "Because someone used that ritual to kill?" "No, because someone believed it was only a ritual, that it had no soul." He lifted his demitasse. It steamed faintly. Giancarlo Moretti knew better. So did his killer. That's what made it a crime. He sipped. I raised my own cup a little behind the beat. "To the truth," Wolfe arched a brow. "To honesty, Mr. Goodwin, the rarer roast." I grinned. "I'll drink to that." We did. The brownstones settled, rain tapered, the world outside went on lying to itself. Inside, though, things were clean again, and somewhere deep in the cellar, the Tenebra beans were sealed in a tin-marked evidence, sitting beside forgotten poisons and untold secrets, filed, labeled, and most importantly under control, just the way Wolfe likes it. The following morning began like most endings do in Wolfe's world, not with triumph, but with quiet protocol. Fritz had just set the eggs on the table when the doorbell rang. One chime long and certain, not the press of a delivery boy or a neighbor with poor judgment. This was the kind of ring that wanted answers, not entry. Wolfe muttered something about timing and gestured for me to go. I opened the door to Inspector Crema, who stood there dripping in his trench coat, cigar unlit, but clenched between his teeth like it owed him rent. "Goodwin," he said, "for you've been busy." "That's one word for it," I replied. "Come on in before you drown." He stepped inside, peeled off the coat, and gave Fritz a nod. "Still feeding this madhouse well, Fritz?" Fritz smiled. "Mr. Wolfe insists, and one." "Whole things," I added. Wolfe, still seated and fortified by orange juice, looked up as Kramer entered the office and took the red chair without asking. "You've already spoken with the Bureau?" Wolfe asked without preamble. Kramer nodded. "They're tying up the formal charges. Della Vecchia won't make bail. Rourke's singing like a drunk canary. She's terrified, not of the feds, of you." Wolfe's expression didn't change. "Good. You ever going to explain how you got the ledger?" Kramer asked. "No," Wolfe said, and that was that. Kramer took it with only a mild flare of the nostrils. "Fine. Doesn't matter now. They're trying to sweep some of it under national interest, but you and that damn book forced their hand. There's going to be a dozen resignations by the end of the week. Maybe more. You know what that means?" Wolfe nodded solemnly. Dinner reservations will become easier. Kramer barked a short laugh, then sighed. There's pressure to keep your name out of it. I insist, Wolfe said. I detest the attention. Yeah, Kramer muttered. Your ego gets fat enough in private. He stood, placed a folded document on Wolfe's desk and nodded to me. For the files, he said. He was gone before I could ask what it was. Wolfe unfolded the paper slowly, read it, then handed it to me. It was a preliminary statement from the Bureau acknowledging the contribution of a private civilian analysis that had led to the identification and arrest of multiple figures in connection with cross-border fraud and trafficking. No names, no credit. Just a nod in bureaucratese. Wolfe closed his eyes. I waited a minute, then said, Well, that's that, I guess. No, Wolfe murmured. There's one matter left. I raised a brow. You're not seriously thinking there's another layer to this thing? No, I'm considering the moral residue. That was Wolfe's phrase when a case left a taste that no amount of wine or wit could clear from the palate. He gestured toward his bookshelf. In the ledger, there were 4 names not yet identified, acronyms, coded references. One of them, I suspect, belongs to someone still active, someone in the supply chain. You think there's a survivor, or a copycat? I think, Wolfe said slowly, that something this elaborate does not occur in isolation. Luca Della Vecchia did not operate alone. He built infrastructure. Someone will inherit it. You want to go after them? No, that is not our role. I waited. But I will inform the Bureau of the names, and I will ensure Miss Moretti receives protection, even if unofficially. That was about as emotional as Wolfe got. The rest of the morning passed in a rare quiet. I filed the transcript, secured the notebook in Wolfe's personal archive, and shredded the rest of our working notes. The case was officially closed, but it had left its mark. Not because it had been especially violent or convoluted, but because it had been so calculated, a murder by invitation, death brewed with memory, motive hidden in nostalgia. And the weapon? Just a cup of something you'd tasted your whole life. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No. Return address. Inside a single note. He wouldn't have wanted it any other way, thank you. CM. I passed it to Wolfe. He read it, said nothing, slipped it into a drawer. By dinner time, the brownstone had returned to its natural rhythm. Fritz prepared squab with lentils and roasted shallots. The wine was a 2012 Brunello Wolfe had been saving for the right occasion. This qualifies, I asked, swirling the glass. Barely, he said. After dessert, honey panna cotta and poached pear. Wolfe leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. Archie. Yes, sir. There is a certain irony I find difficult to ignore. Just the one. This killer, Della Vecchia. He believed that control made him immune to consequence. That orchestrating a death through heritage, through ritual, somehow excused it. Because it was quiet. Poison instead of bullets. Deception instead of force, Wolfe said. But death is always loud. It echoes. It reverberates through the lives around it. I finished my wine. So what's the moral? He raised a brow. Do you require one? Just curious. Wolfe looked toward the dining room window, where the last of the day's light was slipping down the brick of the neighboring building. Coffee, he said slowly, should not be an act of fear. That was it. No epilogue, no great triumph. Just order restored. The espresso machine in the kitchen hissed to life. Fritz was brewing a final demitasse, the evening ritual. Wolfe lifted his cup, studied it, then took a sip with the care of a man, drinking not just coffee, but the memory of a case solved. Bittersweet, balanced and finished. And me? I poured myself a fresh cup too. Because after days of poisoned beans, betrayal, and old debts roasted into revenge, sometimes you need the smallest thing to remind you the world's still in one piece. Even if, just beneath the surface, something. Darker always lingers. But tonight the cup was clean, and that was enough. The case was over, but Wolfe hadn't left his chair all day. I could tell by the way the seat cushion retained its perfect buttock-shaped depression, and the fact that the footstool hadn't budged an inch. In the brownstone, that's about as loud as pacing. I'd spent the morning confirming what little needed confirming. Della Vecchia's arraignment was scheduled. Rourke had officially flipped and was supplying names, and the ledger Wolfe had unearthed was now the centerpiece. Of 3 federal indictments, the newspapers were circling, sniffing for a name behind the curtain, but so far Wolfe's name hadn't leaked. I would have called that a miracle, but Wolfe would have called it design. He was sipping beer, Rochefort 10, heavy and dark, while I sat across from him with a notepad filled with notes I didn't need to take and questions he wouldn't answer. I finally broke the silence. "Anything left you're still chewing on?" Wolfe took another sip, then placed the glass on its coaster. He looked at me with the expression of a man about to fold a napkin before cutting someone's logic in half. "Archie, do you recall the Greek word pharmakon?" I skipped ancient Greek to take shorthand. He ignored that. "It means both remedy and poison, same word." "Cute," I said. "You getting philosophical on me now?" This case demanded it. He leaned back, hands steepled. "We began with a death dressed as routine. A cup of espresso, a solitary man, no violence, no mess. On the surface, it was the picture of serenity. But underneath, rot." I nodded. "That ledger was filthier than a mob laundry." "Indeed. But what made this case significant, what makes it linger, is not just the crime, it's the context. The killer used familiarity as camouflage, used something comforting, something sacred as the vehicle for death, like slipping cyanide into a family recipe, precisely. And in doing so," Wolfe continued, "Della Vecchia did not just attempt murder, he attempted erasure, of history, of regret, of accountability." "That's a lot to stir into one demitasse," I said. "Then consider this. Giancarlo Moretti was no innocent, but in his final years he attempted something rare. He tried to make peace with his past, and got killed for it." "No," Wolfe said. "He got killed because he failed to fear the past." I let that one sit. The rain from the night before had cleared, and late spring sun now spilled through the office windows, giving the dust motes their daily moment in the spotlight. Wolfe closed his eyes, not asleep, but in his peculiar state, full of conscious stillness, cataloguing details, weighing events, ordering the narrative to his liking. I thought about Celeste Moretti. She hadn't contacted us again, but I'd seen her name in an article that morning. "Moretti imports rebrands under new leadership. Legacy not for sale, says new CEO." I showed Wolfe the headline. He read it, made a soft, nasal sound, and handed it back. "She'll do," he said. It was as close to a benediction as anyone ever got from him. I stood, walked to the sideboard, and poured myself a glass of rye. Something to cut the flavor of finality Wolfe always stirred into these post-mortem conversations. "You think she'll keep the company clean?" I asked possibly, Wolfe said. "But that isn't the point." "What is?" "She now understands the cost of cleanliness." That was Wolfe, always packaging truth in oblique wrapping. But I got it. Celeste wasn't just stepping into her uncle's business. She was stepping into the shadow he'd tried to escape. But unlike Giancarlo, she wasn't pretending the past was behind her. She was bringing it with her, ledger and all. We didn't get many cases like this. Most jobs were more transactional. Find the cheat, catch the killer, prove the motive. But this one had layers, like a millefeuille made of secrets, regret, and roasted beans. The phone rang at 5:43 p.m., right as Fritz was finishing preparations for dinner. I picked up. Nero Wolfe's residence. There was a pause, then a familiar voice. Celeste. "Tell Mr. Wolfe thank you," she said. "But also tell him, my uncle wasn't trying to make peace. He was trying to write an ending he could live with." I relayed the message after she hung up. Wolfe nodded once. A distinction worth remembering. Dinner that night was quiet. Capon, with saffron rice and sautéed dandelion greens. Wolfe finished every bite, which meant his mind was finally releasing its grip on the case. After the plates were cleared, he poured himself another beer and gestured for me to join him in the office. I did, mostly because it was tradition now. Post-case silence followed by a final word, a moral or sometimes just a grim joke to signal that the world was back in order. Wolfe lifted his glass. "To coffee." I raised mine. "To caution." He smirked. "To survival, then, one cup at a time." We drank. Outside, the city returned to its usual rhythms, horns, footsteps, dogs barking at the indifferent sky. But inside the brownstone everything was balanced again. The desk was clean, the orchids bloomed upstairs, and no one was trying to kill us, for now. I cleaned up the day's notes, filed the letter from Celeste in the archive, and turned out the lights in the office. Wolfe had already retreated to the plant rooms, where he'd spend the next hour coaxing a rare Miltoniopsis into bloom. I paused at the stairs. Maybe, I thought, we're all just roasts waiting for the wrong hands. But as long as Wolfe stayed in, his chair and I kept answering the door, we could keep the brew clean and the bitter where it belonged in the cup. The day after Celeste Moretti's last call, things settled into a lull. Wolfe resumed his routine with such seamlessness, you'd never know a few days ago he was facing down a transnational killer, with only a chair, a ledger, and a withering glare. The orchids resumed their tyrannical command of his mornings. Fritz reclaimed the kitchen from emotional subtext and forensic contamination, and I caught up on paperwork, and very nearly fell asleep over a shoebox full of receipts from a vinegar smuggling case we'd handled 2 months back. But even as the dust cleared, I knew better than to assume we were done. In Wolfe's world, justice doesn't stop at handcuffs. It waits for a full circle, and the circle came knocking just before dinner. The man was small, well-dressed, and nervous. He wore a tightly cut grey suit and carried a briefcase like it might explode if tilted. He introduced himself as Emery Garrison, lawyer for a secondary stakeholder in Vesuvio Holdings. Wolfe, already at his desk and eyeing his sherry, allowed the man exactly 8 minutes. "I represent Mr. Barreto," Garrison said, "an investor who had a minor but material stake in one of the shell companies named in the Moretti ledger." "Mr. Barreto," Wolfe said without looking up, "is the silent partner Della Vecchia referred to in code as Caspian, a name that appears 16 times, always linked to off-books payouts and freights that carried little to no coffee." Garrison blinked. I wouldn't know. Spare us," Wolfe cut in, voice quiet but razored. "Your client financed the concealment of narcotic shipments in bean exports. He thought the chain of custody was erased when Della Vecchia was arrested, and—" Rourke turned witness. He was mistaken. I stood just off Garrison's shoulder. "You came here to offer hush money?" "I came," Garrison said quickly, "to propose that Mr. Wolfe accept a professional retainer in exchange for his discretion moving forward." Wolfe looked at him as if observing a fly attempting chess. "Mr. Garrison, you may inform your client that Nero Wolfe is not for sale. Not by beans, not by coin, and not by lawyers with damp cuffs." Garrison left in a hurry. Wolfe waited until the door latched, then called for me. "Archie, the name Barreto. Trace every holding linked to Vesuvio's East Coast expansion." Discreetly. If he attempts acquisition, I want a dossier on his methods before he finishes his espresso. How are you planning to turn it over to the feds? No, to Celeste Moretti. I blinked. Why her? She has the opportunity to reform Moretti Imports from a brand of shadow to one of transparency. But she must know where the shadows lie, or else she will inherit them unchallenged. I nodded. That made sense. Wolfe didn't like leaving unfinished books on the shelf, especially ones with blood on the binding. The next morning I handed Celeste a padded envelope outside her new Brooklyn roasting facility. No press, no signatures, just a quiet handoff. On a quiet street. She opened it, glanced at the name inside, and nodded once. Thank you. You planning to make this public? I'm planning to survive it, she said, and make sure no one forgets what he tried to bury. That afternoon, the press ran a story. Vesuvio executive implicated in historical fraud, ties to Della Vecchia ring uncovered. No mention of Wolfe. No mention of me. Just a ripple across the surface of the industry shaking loose what remained of the rot. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe read the headline in silence. You didn't have to give her that, I said. I did, he said. There is a difference. I stood by the window for a while, watching the first heat of June settle over the city. The brownstone was still, and the air smelled faintly of bergamot and orchids. It's over now? I asked. For now. You think another Della Vecchia is out there? There always is, Wolfe said, but there is also coffee and order and choice. That was as hopeful as the man got. Fritz served dinner early. Duck à l'orange, roasted artichokes, and polenta whipped to a texture that could pass for silk. Wolfe ate heartily and requested a demitasse afterward, not because the case was done, but because the ritual mattered again. The fear had passed. The bitterness was, for now, behind the tongue. As he sipped, I leaned back and watched the room settle into its rhythm. The lights were soft, the office was clean. The city outside still spun its mad gears, but in that moment, the balance held. Wolfe placed his cup down, folded his napkin with precision and looked at me. Archie. Yes, sir? If someone ever attempts to poison me through coffee, I'll switch you to tea. Don't joke. I wasn't. He sniffed. Then do one thing more. What's that? Make sure it's bad coffee. So I know. To stop drinking, I grinned. Deal. He grunted, something halfway between annoyance and contentment, and turned back to his book. I turned off the office lights one by one and let the silence take its rightful place. The case was closed. The danger was done, and for once the last cup was clean.